2,500 years ago, there was no rice on most Chinese tables, no woks, no soy sauce, no tofu, no tea. Almost nothing you think of as Chinese food existed. The grain that ordinary people ate, day after day, season after season, for their entire lives, was so monotonous and so far removed from modern Chinese cuisine that it would be unrecognizable to a modern diner. And yet, this was the era when Confucius himself was writing about the proper way to cut meat and the moral significance of a well-prepared meal, when the rituals of cooking were becoming inseparable from the rituals of civilization itself. The food was plain. The ideas about food were extraordinary. So what did people in ancient China actually eat 2,500 years ago? The answer begins not with rice, but with a grain most Westerners have barely heard of. Let us place ourselves in the world. It is approximately 500 years before the Common Era, give or take a few decades, because precision with ancient Chinese dates is often impossible. The dynasty that nominally rules all of China is the Zhou, but the Zhou kings have been politically irrelevant for generations, reduced to ceremonial figureheads performing rituals in their small domain around the city of Luoyang, while the real power has fractured into dozens of competing states. This is the period historians call the Spring and Autumn Era, named after the chronicle of the state of Lu, Confucius's home state, and it is a time of almost constant warfare, shifting alliances, political intrigue, and remarkable intellectual ferment. The great philosophical schools that would shape Chinese civilization for the next 2 millennia, Confucianism, Taoism, legalism, Mohism, are being born in this turbulent landscape, and many of their ideas are directly connected to food, farming, and the relationship between what people eat and how they should live. The geography matters enormously because in ancient China, geography determined diet more absolutely than in almost any other civilization. The country divides roughly into 2 halves along a line that runs east to west through the center. To the north lies the Great Yellow River Plain, a vast, flat, wind-scoured landscape of lowest soil, dry and cold in winter, hot and dusty in summer. This is millet country. The grain that fed northern China for thousands of years was not rice, but millet. 2 varieties in particular, foxtail millet, called su, and broomcorn millet, called shu. These were tough, drought-resistant grains that could survive the harsh conditions of the northern plains, and they form the absolute foundation of the diet for the majority of Chinese people. To the south, in the warmer, wetter landscape of the Yangtze River Valley, and beyond, rice was cultivated in flooded paddies. But 2,500 years ago, the political and cultural center of Chinese civilization was firmly in the north, in the Yellow River Basin, and that meant millet was king. If you were an ordinary person in this time and place, millet was not just your staple food. It was, in a very real sense, the only food that mattered. Everything else, the meat, the vegetables, the seasonings, existed in relation to it. A meal without millet was not a meal. It was just scraps. The agricultural year dictated everything about food, and understanding it is essential to understanding what ended up in the bowl. Millet was planted in spring and harvested in autumn. The farmer's calendar, passed down through oral tradition and formalized in texts like the Xiaoxiaozheng, one of the earliest Chinese agricultural almanacs, divided the year into precise segments, each demanding specific tasks. In spring, the soil was broken with wooden plows tipped with stone, or increasingly, iron blades, pulled by human labor or by oxen, if the family was fortunate enough to own one. The seeds were scattered by hand, pressed into the earth with bare feet. Through summer, the fields demanded constant weeding, watering when rain failed, and anxious watching for the locust swarms that could strip a field to bare stalks in hours. Autumn was the harvest, the great collective labor when entire villages worked from dawn to dark, cutting, threshing, and winnowing the grain, separating the precious kernels from the chaff by tossing them in the wind. Then came winter storage, and here the reality of ancient food preservation shaped everything. There was no canning, no refrigeration, no vacuum sealing. Grain was stored in sealed clay jars or in underground pits lined with straw, and the constant enemies were moisture, insects, and rats. A family's survival through the winter months depended entirely on how much grain they had managed to store and how well they could protect it. The concept of the 5 grains, wugu, captures the agricultural reality of the period. The 5 were millet, both foxtail and broomcorn varieties, wheat, rice, hemp seed, and soybeans. Not all 5 grew everywhere. Rice was limited to the south. Wheat was still a relatively minor crop in the north. But together they represented the totality. Hemp seeds, which modern readers might find surprising, were a genuine food crop. The seeds were roasted and eaten or pressed for oil, and hemp was simultaneously cultivated for its fiber, which was spun into the rough cloth that ordinary people wore. Soybeans were consumed boiled, ground into a coarse meal, or fermented, and their fermentation was the beginning of the great Chinese tradition of bean-based condiments that would eventually produce soy sauce, miso, and doubanjiang. But the transformative invention of tofu, coagulating soy milk into a soft curd, lay centuries in the future. In Confucius's time, the soybean was a humble, somewhat indigestible crop that required fermentation or extended cooking to become palatable. The physical space where ancient Chinese food was prepared and consumed tells you a great deal about the civilization that built it. If you are a commoner, a farmer, or a craftsman in one of the walled towns that dot the Yellow River Plain, your home is a modest structure of rammed earth walls with a thatched roof. The floor is packed dirt, swept clean but perpetually dusty. The room is dim, lit by the doorway, and perhaps a single small window covered with oiled paper or left open to the elements. The kitchen, if you can call it that, is a corner of the main room dominated by a clay stove, a raised earthen platform with 1 or 2 fire holes on top, fed by a firebox on one side. You burn straw, dried millet stalks, or wood gathered from increasingly scarce forests. The smoke has nowhere to go. It fills the upper half of the room in a permanent haze that blackens the thatch and stings your eyes. Your cooking vessels are clay pots, a large round-bottomed pot for boiling grain, a shallow basin for steaming, perhaps a 3-legged clay tripod called a li that can be set directly over embers. The sound of the kitchen is the crackle of burning straw and the soft bubbling of grain porridge. The smell is wood smoke mixed with the earthy, slightly musty scent of cooking millet. But if you are a member of the aristocracy, a minor lord, an official in the service of one of the warring states, your kitchen is an entirely different world. The cooking is done in a separate building by specialized servants or even enslaved workers, and the vessels are not clay but bronze. The bronze cooking vessels of ancient China are among the most extraordinary objects ever created by any civilization. The ding, a massive cauldron on 3 or 4 legs, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds, cast with intricate decorations of dragons, Taote masks, and geometric patterns, was not merely a pot. It was a symbol of political power so potent that the number of Dinger ruler possessed defined his rank. The son of heaven, the Joking, was entitled to 9 ding. A feudal lord received 7, a minister 5, a common official 3. To cook in bronze was to perform an act of political and spiritual significance. The food prepared in these vessels was not just sustenance. It was an offering to the ancestors, a demonstration of legitimacy, and a statement about your place in the cosmic order. There is a reason the Chinese phrase for losing political power, losing the ding, refers to a cooking pot. Food and power were inseparable. Step into the kitchen of such a household, and the sensory experience shifts dramatically. The bronze vessels gleam dully in the firelight, a ghee for serving grain, a do for serving fermented sauces, a he for warming wine, a yan for steaming. The heat from the fires is intense, and the kitchen workers move with practiced efficiency, their bare feet slapping on the stone floor. You hear the rhythmic thud of a pestle pounding grain in a stone mortar. You smell something unfamiliar and pungent, a sharp, almost fishy, fermented odor that rises from ceramic jars stored in a cool corner. This is jiang, a fermented paste made from meat, fish, or grain that served as the primary seasoning for almost everything the ancient Chinese ate. We will return to jiang shortly because it is one of the most important and most misunderstood elements of ancient Chinese cuisine. Now let us walk through what a typical day of eating actually looked like, because the rhythm of meals in ancient China was very different from what we are accustomed to. Most people ate twice a day, a morning meal and an evening meal. The concept of 3 daily meals was a later development, and for the laboring majority, 2 meals was both tradition and economic necessity. There simply was not enough food for more. You rise before dawn because agricultural life demands it. The roosters have been crowing since the sky first began to lighten in the east, and by the time you can see your hand in front of your face, you are already at work, feeding the animals, checking the fields, drawing water from the well. The morning meal, when it comes, is almost always the same thing: millet porridge. The grain has been pounded to remove the husk, boiled in water until it breaks down into a thick, starchy gruel, the color of pale gold. It is bland. It is filling. It is warm. And it is what you eat every single morning of your life. If you are fortunate, you might add a handful of wild greens, mallow, amaranth, shepherd's purse, gathered from the edges of the fields or from the uncultivated hillsides. A pinch of salt, if you have it. But salt was expensive, controlled by the state, and for many families it was a luxury used sparingly, not a daily seasoning. You eat your porridge from a coarse ceramic bowl, drinking the liquid and scooping the thicker grain with your fingers or with a flat wooden spoon. Chopsticks existed in this period, but they were primarily used for picking pieces of food from a shared pot during cooking, not yet as the universal eating utensil they would later become. The evening meal is the more substantial one, and if you are an ordinary farmer, it might include, in addition to the eternal millet porridge, a dish of boiled vegetables, perhaps turnips, which were one of the most common root vegetables of the period, or beans that had been soaked and simmered until soft. On rare occasions, a festival, a successful hunt, a sacrifice, there might be meat. But meat for common people was genuinely rare. The Confucian philosopher Mencius, writing about his ideal society roughly a century after Confucius, described a vision in which every family of 5 could eat meat regularly, and the fact that he presented this as an aspiration, a goal to be achieved through wise governance, tells you how far it was from reality. Most peasant families ate meat a handful of times per year at most, usually in connection with religious sacrifices or festivals. The rest of the time, the protein in their diet came from beans, from small amounts of dried fish when available, and occasionally from insects, silkworm pupae, which were consumed after the silk had been harvested from the cocoons, were a common and valued protein source in regions where sericulture was practiced. Vegetables were seasonal and limited, but more varied than you might expect. The turnip and the radish were staples, hardy root vegetables that could be stored through winter in earth-covered pits. Chinese cabbage, mallow, leeks, garlic, scallions, gourds, and various legumes supplemented the diet when available. Wild plants foraged from hillsides and riverbanks were not a supplement. For many families, they were essential. Bamboo shoots, water chestnuts, lotus root, fern fronds, and dozens of wild greens that have no common English name were gathered, boiled, and eaten. Pickling in vinegar and salt brine was the primary method of preserving vegetables through the winter months, and the sour, sharp flavor of pickled greens became a defining taste of common Chinese food, a taste that persists in Chinese cuisine to this day. Fruit was seasonal and limited. The jujube, the Chinese date, was the most important fruit, eaten fresh in autumn and dried for winter consumption. Peaches, plums, apricots, and chestnuts were available in season, but fruit was never a major part of the diet. It was a supplement, a treat, a seasonal pleasure that came and went with the rhythm of the agricultural year. But there is a reason we need to talk about what the wealthy ate, because the food of the ancient Chinese elite was astonishingly complex, ritualized, and, by the standards of any ancient civilization, remarkably diverse. The Book of Rites, the Liji, one of the great Confucian classics compiled from materials dating to this period, contains passages about food preparation that read like a high-end restaurant guide. It describes specific cuts of meat, proper cooking methods for different animals, seasonal eating guidelines, and elaborate rules about which foods should be paired with which sauces. The level of culinary sophistication is startling. The meats available to the aristocracy included the so-called 6 domestic animals: horse, ox, sheep, pig, dog, and chicken. Of these, the one that most surprises modern Western readers is dog. Dog meat was not merely acceptable in ancient China, it was a delicacy. There were specialist dog butchers. Specific breeds were raised for the table. Dog meat was considered warming, rich, and particularly appropriate for autumn and winter consumption. The philosopher Fan Kuai, an associate of Liu Bang who would later found the Han dynasty, was a dog butcher by trade before he entered politics, and there was no stigma attached to the profession. The prejudice against eating dog is a modern Western cultural norm projected backward. In ancient China, a well-prepared dog was a mark of a generous host. Pork was already important, but had not yet achieved the overwhelming dominance it would hold in later Chinese cuisine. Mutton and lamb were prestigious foods, particularly in the northern states close to the steppe frontier. Beef was eaten, but was hedged with restrictions because oxen were too valuable as draft animals to slaughter casually. Killing a working ox without good reason could, in some states, bring legal punishment. Wild game supplemented the domestic supply. Deer, wild boar, hare, pheasant, quail, and various waterfowl were hunted by the aristocracy and their retainers. Fish held a special place in the cuisine, particularly freshwater fish from the rivers and lakes that crisscrossed the landscape. Carp was the most common and most prized freshwater fish. It was prepared in a startling variety of ways: boiled in broth, grilled over charcoal, dried and preserved in salt, fermented into a pungent condiment. One of the most fascinating ancient Chinese preparations was raw fish, thin slices of fresh carp served with a dipping sauce of vinegar and jiang. This dish, called kwai, was consumed by the Chinese elite more than 2,000 years before Japanese sashimi became famous. Confucius himself is recorded in the Analerta as being particular about his fish. He did not eat fish that was not fresh. He did not eat meat that was not properly cut. The sage was, by all accounts, a demanding diner. And this brings us to the most critical element of ancient Chinese cuisine, the element that separates it from virtually every other food culture on earth at this time: the sauces. While the grain was monotonous and the meat was occasional, the sauces and fermented condiments of ancient China were breathtakingly complex. The master category was jiang, a word that modern Chinese uses for soy sauce, but that, 2,500 years ago, referred to an entire family of fermented pastes and liquids. There was meat jiang, made by fermenting minced meat with salt and grain in sealed ceramic jars for months. There was fish jiang, similar to the fish sauce of Southeast Asia, made from salted, fermented fish. There was grain jiang, made from fermented soybeans, wheat, or millet. And this last variety was the distant ancestor of the soy sauce we know today, though it was thicker, coarser, and far more pungent than the refined liquid that would develop over the following centuries. The Li Ji lists specific sauce pairings with an exactitude that would impress a modern chef. Roasted pig is to be served with meat jiang mixed with vinegar. Steamed fish requires mustard sauce. Grilled meat calls for a sauce of jiang with ginger and cinnamon. These were not suggestions. They were rules, codified as part of the ritual order that governed aristocratic life. To serve the wrong sauce with the wrong dish was not a culinary error. It was a breach of propriety, a failure of civilization. Confucius captured this attitude with characteristic precision. If the sauce was not right, he would not eat. This was not fussiness. It was philosophy. The other great flavoring agents included vinegar, made from fermented grain, already widely produced and considered essential, salt, ginger, Sichuan peppercorn, which produces a unique numbing, tingling sensation on the tongue rather than heat, cinnamon bark, star anise, and various pungent plants from the allium family, garlic, scallions, and Chinese chives. What was conspicuously absent was chili pepper. There was no chili in ancient China. Chili peppers are a New World plant that would not reach China until the 16th or 17th century via Portuguese and Spanish traders. The fiery heat that defines much of modern Chinese cuisine, Sichuan, Henan, Guizhou, simply did not exist. The dominant flavor profile of ancient Chinese food was not hot. It was sour, salty, and pungent, a combination of vinegar, salt, fermented jiang, and the unique numbing tingle of Sichuan peppercorn. Honey was known but not widely available. It was gathered from wild hives rather than cultivated, and was treated as a luxury. Malt sugar, made by sprouting grain and extracting the sweet liquid, was the more common sweetener and was used in some ceremonial dishes and confections. The overall flavor world of ancient China was austere compared to the explosive palate of modern Chinese cooking. No chili heat, no refined sugar sweetness, no deep soy sauce umami as we know it. But it was not bland. The combination of sharp vinegar, salty jiang, numbing Sichuan peppercorn, pungent garlic and ginger, and the rich depth of fermented bean and meat pastes created a flavor profile that was complex, layered, and utterly distinctive. If you could taste the food of Confucius's era, it would remind you more of Korean or Japanese cuisine than of the Sichuan cooking we associate with China today. The preparation of grain itself was more complex than simply boiling it into porridge. Millet could be cooked as fan, steamed or boiled until the individual grains were distinct and fluffy, similar to how rice is served today, or as zhou, the soupy porridge that was the everyday staple. Wheat, which was gradually becoming more common in the north, was ground between stone querns into coarse flour and made into a simple flatbread baked on the walls of the clay stove, or into thick noodle-like strips that were boiled in broth. The refinement of wheat flour into the silky, elastic dough that would produce Chinese noodles, dumplings, and baozi lay in the future, but the basic technology of stone grinding and dough making was already in place. The soups of the period deserve special mention because they represent an entire category of food that tends to be overlooked. Jiang, a thick, savory soup made by boiling meat or vegetables in water and thickening the broth with grain flour or starch, was a central dish at every aristocratic meal and a treasured luxury for commoners. The word jiang appears more frequently than almost any other food term in the ancient texts. A good jiang required careful seasoning with jiang, vinegar and ginger, and achieving the right consistency, not too thin, not too thick, was considered a test of a cook's skill. Yi Yin, a legendary figure who served as advisor to the founder of the Shang dynasty, was said to have been a cook before entering politics, and the metaphors he used to explain governance were drawn directly from the kitchen. Governing a state, he reportedly told the king, was like making a perfect jiang, balancing flavors, adjusting proportions, knowing when to add and when to hold back. The cooking methods were limited by available technology, but were more varied than you might expect. Boiling was the most common. Millet porridge, soups, and stews were the everyday staples. Steaming was widely practiced, using stacked bamboo or clay vessels over boiling water. Roasting over open flame or charcoal was used primarily for meat, especially for sacrificial offerings. Grilling on skewers was known. Drying, salting, and fermenting were the essential preservation methods in a world without refrigeration. What was missing was stir-frying, the high-heat, rapid cooking technique that would become synonymous with Chinese cuisine. Stir-frying requires a wok and extremely high temperatures from a powerful stove, and neither the thin-walled iron wok nor the forced draft stove that enables wok cooking had been developed yet. Iron itself was still relatively new. The transition from bronze to iron was underway, but far from complete. The fast, flashy, flame-licked cooking that fills modern Chinese restaurant kitchens would have been impossible and unimaginable in Confucius's time. The beverages of the period deserve special attention because what people drank in ancient China defies almost every modern assumption. Tea, the drink most associated with Chinese civilization, was not consumed as a daily beverage. There is virtually no reliable evidence of tea drinking as a widespread social practice before the Han Dynasty, several centuries later, and it would not become the national drink until the Tang Dynasty, a full 1,000 years after the period we are discussing. What people drank apart from water was jiu, an alcoholic beverage fermented from millet or rice. Calling jiu wine is conventional but slightly misleading. It was not grape wine. It was a grain fermentation, more similar in principle to beer but differing significantly in production method and flavor. Millet jiu was cloudy, slightly sweet, relatively low in alcohol, and consumed in enormous quantities at banquets, sacrifices, and festivals. It was heated before drinking, served warm in bronze vessels and poured into small cups. The aroma was yeasty and faintly fruity, and its warmth spreading through the body on a cold northern evening must have been one of the genuine pleasures of ancient life. The production of jiu was itself a sophisticated process. The grain was soaked, steamed, and then mixed with a starter culture called Q, a cake of grain that had been allowed to develop a complex colony of molds and yeasts. This Q was the engine of fermentation, breaking down the starches in the grain into sugars, and then into alcohol. Different Q formulas produce different flavors, and the best Q recipes were closely guarded secrets passed down within brewing families. The fermentation took place in large ceramic jars sealed with clay, and the process could last from days to months, depending on the strength and character desired. The resulting liquid was strained through coarse. At formal banquets, dew was served in a strictly ritualized sequence. The host offered a cup, the guest returned the toast, and the drinking proceeded through a choreographed series of exchanges that reinforced the social bond between the participants. Getting drunk was common and not particularly stigmatized, but losing control to the point of causing disorder was. Confucius, who had opinions about everything, noted, "There is no limit to the amount of dew one may drink, provided one does not become disorderly." This was not a prohibition. It was a standard of conduct. Drink as much as you want, but maintain your dignity. Food was also commerce, and the markets of ancient Chinese towns were vibrant, chaotic, and tightly regulated spaces where the full diversity of regional food production became visible. Markets operated on fixed schedules, some daily, others at intervals, and were overseen by officials called sashimi, market managers, who enforced standards of weight, quality, and pricing. Walking through a town market in the state of Qi or Lu, you would see stalls selling grain in woven baskets, bundles of dried vegetables, jars of jiang and vinegar sealed with clay lids, strings of dried fish hanging from wooden frames, live chickens in wicker cages, cuts of pork and mutton displayed on wooden blocks, and the ever-present salt merchants whose product was so essential and so profitable that the state of Qi would eventually build its economic power largely on a government monopoly of salt production. The sounds were a cacophony of bargaining, the bleating of sheep, the squawking of poultry, and the rhythmic calls of vendors advertising their goods. The smells were overwhelming. Fermented jiang, fresh blood from the butcher's stall, roasting chestnuts, the sharp tang of vinegar, the earthy musk of raw grain, and beneath it all the permanent background odor of open drains and animal waste that characterized every ancient town. Cowrie shells and later bronze coins changed hands in small transactions. Barter was still common for larger exchanges. A jar of good jiang might be worth several measures of grain. A fat pig could buy a family's salt supply for months. The social rituals surrounding food in ancient China were more elaborate and more philosophically charged than in perhaps any other civilization of the period. Eating was never just eating. Every meal in an aristocratic household was a performance of hierarchy, a demonstration of ritual knowledge, and a statement about the moral character of the participants. The seating arrangement at a banquet was rigidly determined by rank. The host sat facing south, the direction associated with authority and the ruler. The most honored guest sat facing west. Everyone else was arranged according to their status, and sitting in the wrong position was an insult that could have serious consequences. Food was served on individual low tables. Each diner had their own table rather than sharing a common one, which is the opposite of later Chinese practice. And the dishes were arranged according to precise rules described in the Li Ji. Grain was placed to the left. Meat was placed to the right. Sauces were placed in front. Pickled vegetables behind. The arrangement was not random. It reflected the cosmological order, yin and yang, the 5 elements, the correspondence between human action and cosmic harmony. The tableware itself tells a story of social division as stark as the food. A commoner ate from coarse grey pottery, simple bowls and cups fired in local kilns, unglazed or covered in a thin ash glaze, functional and undecorated. The aristocracy ate from lacquerware, wooden vessels coated with layers of refined tree sap that was polished to a luminous sheen in red, black, or sometimes decorated with gold and silver inlay. Lacquerware was light, beautiful, resistant to heat and moisture, and enormously expensive. A single lacquered cup required dozens of coats applied over weeks or months of painstaking labor. The contrast between a peasant's rough clay bowl of millet porridge and a lord's gleaming red lacquer dish of seasoned gang, served with jiang in a separate lacquer vessel, accompanied by warm wine in a bronze heap. This contrast was not incidental. It was the point. Food in ancient China was a language of power, and every object on the table spoke it fluently. Eating etiquette was similarly stratified and codified. The Liji contains extensive rules for dining behavior. Do not make noise while chewing. Do not throw bones to the dogs during a formal meal. Do not pick your teeth. Do not gulp your soup. Do not slurp audibly when drinking. Do not put chewed food back on the serving dish. When eating with a superior, you must wait for them to begin before touching your food. When offered a dish, you must taste it before expressing thanks. When the host places food on your table, you must straighten your posture and acknowledge it. These rules were not arbitrary refinements. They were the behavioral infrastructure of a hierarchical society, a society that believed social order began at the dinner table and radiated outward from there into every aspect of human relationships. The most important food events were not meals, but sacrifices. Ancestor worship was the bedrock of ancient Chinese religion, and the primary way you honored your ancestors was by offering them food. The sacrificial foods were specific and hierarchically graded. The most important sacrifices required an ox, a sheep, and a pig, the so-called tai lao, or great sacrifice. Lesser sacrifices used fewer animals. The food was prepared with enormous care, placed on altar tables in the ancestral temple, and presented with formal prayers and ritual music. After the spirits of the ancestors had consumed the essence of the food, and the ancient Chinese genuinely believed this happened, the physical food was then consumed by the living participants in a communal feast. This was not symbolic. It was believed to be a real act of communion between the living and the dead, and the quality of the food directly reflected the sincerity of your devotion. To offer poor food to your ancestors was an act of impiety that could bring misfortune upon the entire family. The great festivals of the agricultural calendar were the moments when food transcended daily survival and became celebration. The most important was the sacrifice at the winter solstice, a communal feast honoring the ancestors and the spirits of the soil that ensured the harvest. For this occasion, even modest families slaughtered whatever animal they could afford: a chicken, a dog, a pig if they had one. The meat was prepared with special care, offered first to the spirits, and then consumed in a feast that brought the extended family together. Rice cakes, special grain preparations, and the best jiang were brought out of storage. Millet wine flowed more freely than at any other time of year. Musicians played bronze bells and stone chimes. The old songs were sung. For a few hours, the grinding anxiety of agricultural survival lifted, and the warmth of shared food in the dead of winter reminded people what all the labor was for. The harvest festival in autumn was similarly important, a time of relief and gratitude when the granaries were full and the immediate threat of starvation had receded for another year. These festivals were not luxuries. They were psychological necessities, punctuation marks in a calendar of unrelenting labor that kept communities bonded and gave meaning to the endless cycle of planting, tending, and reaping. Confucius's own relationship with food reveals how deeply cuisine was woven into Chinese moral philosophy. The Analerta, the collected sayings of the sage, contains a remarkable passage in which Confucius's food habits are described in detail. He did not eat grain that had gone sour. He did not eat fish that had spoiled. He did not eat meat that had turned color. He did not eat food that smelled bad. He did not eat food that was improperly cooked. He did not eat food that was out of season. He did not eat meat that was not properly cut. He did not eat food that was not served with the correct sauce. Even when meat was plentiful, he ensured that the proportion of meat to grain remained proper. Grain must always dominate the meal. He ate ginger with every meal. He did not talk while eating. These were not the eccentricities of a picky eater. They were the deliberate practices of a man who believed that how you ate was a direct expression of how you lived. That discipline at the table was inseparable from discipline of the mind, and that a civilization that could not feed itself properly could not govern itself properly either. But we have been dwelling in the halls of the elite. The reality for ordinary people, the farmers, the laborers, the soldiers, the vast majority of the population, was starkly different. There was no philosophy at their table. There was survival. The great terror that hung over every farming family was famine, and famine in ancient China was not an abstract threat. It was a recurring catastrophe that shaped every decision, every stored jar of grain, every prayer to the spirits of the soil. The Yellow River, the same river that made agriculture possible by depositing rich low soil across the plains, was also called China's Sorrow, because its catastrophic floods could wipe out an entire season's harvest in a single day. Droughts were equally devastating, turning the dry northern landscape into a dust bowl where millet withered and died in the fields. When famine came, and it came often, people ate whatever they could find: bark, roots, grass, clay mixed with chaff to fill the stomach with something, anything, that created the illusion of fullness. The historical records of this period contain references to famine so severe that people resorted to cannibalism, parents eating their children, neighbors consuming the dead. These are not literary exaggerations. They appear in sober administrative documents recorded by officials whose job was to assess damage and organize relief. The distance between a banquet in the hall of a feudal lord, with its bronze vessels, its carefully paired sauces, its warm millet wine, and a farming family boiling tree bark during a drought year, was not just economic. It was an abyss. The social consequences of famine were equally devastating. Families sold their children into servitude to buy grain. Wives were abandoned because a family could not feed them. Refugees streamed along the roads between states, seeking any ruler who might have stores to distribute. The Confucian philosopher Mencius described encountering roads lined with the bodies of famine victims, and said that a ruler who allowed his people to starve while his own granaries were full was no better than a murderer. This was not metaphor. It was political philosophy born directly from the experience of hunger. The same hunger that sat behind every ritual, every sauce pairing, every bronze ding filled with sacrificial meat. The beauty of ancient Chinese food culture and its darkness were two faces of the same coin, inseparable, each incomprehensible without the other. Disease compounded the misery. Ancient Chinese medicine, while sophisticated in its own theoretical framework, was rooted in the same kind of systematic error that characterized medieval European medicine, a theory that sounded logical but was fundamentally wrong about how the body actually worked. The concept of qi, vital energy flowing through the body along specific channels, and the balancing of yin and yang forces produced treatments that were sometimes harmless, sometimes helpful by accident, and sometimes actively dangerous. Food-related illness was constant and poorly understood. Spoiled meat, contaminated water, parasites in undercooked fish, and the slow poisoning of ergot-contaminated grain all took their toll. Infant mortality was devastating. Perhaps 1 child in 3 did not survive to age 5. Life expectancy, if you made it past childhood, was roughly 40 to 50 years. But many people were broken and old long before that, worn down by decades of back-breaking agricultural labor, chronic malnutrition, untreated dental disease, and the accumulated damage of parasitic infections that were essentially universal in a world without sanitation or safe water. The cooking fire itself was dangerous. Every meal was prepared over open flame in a structure made primarily of earth, straw, and wood. House fires were common and could spread through a crowded village with terrifying speed. Burns from cooking were a routine injury, and without antibiotics, even a minor burn could become infected and kill. The smoke that filled every kitchen, every living space, every waking hour spent indoors caused chronic respiratory damage that modern medicine would recognize as the equivalent of a lifetime of heavy smoking. The eyes of elderly peasants were often clouded with cataracts accelerated by decades of smoke exposure. Their lungs were blackened. Their coughs were perpetual. This was the invisible cost of every bowl of millet porridge. War was the other great destroyer of food security. The spring and autumn period and the warring states era that followed were defined by almost continuous military conflict between the competing states. Armies marched across farmland, consuming or destroying crops. Sieges starved entire cities. Soldiers requisitioned grain from villages that could barely feed themselves. The philosopher Mozi, appalled by the devastation of warfare, calculated the agricultural cost of a single military campaign, the grain consumed by soldiers, the fields left unplowed, the farmers conscripted and killed, and concluded that war was not only morally wrong, but economically insane. His calculations were ignored. The wars continued, and ordinary families went hungry so that armies could eat. When you open your refrigerator tonight and contemplate the almost absurd abundance of choices available to you, fresh vegetables from 3 continents, meat inspected and packaged and temperature controlled from slaughter to table, sauces from a dozen culinary traditions in bottles that will last for months. Remember that for the people who laid the foundations of one of the world's great cuisines, food was not a choice. It was a negotiation with scarcity, a daily reckoning with the limits of what the earth would yield and what the powerful would leave for those who worked it. The ancient Chinese did not invent their food philosophy in spite of hunger. They invented it because of hunger. The obsessive attention to proper preparation, proper seasoning, proper presentation, the rules that Confucius followed and that the Li Ji codified in exhaustive detail, these were not the refinements of a culture with too much time on its hands. They were the response of a civilization that understood, in its bones, that food was the most serious thing in the world, that it could sustain life or destroy it, that it connected the living to the dead, that the way a society fed its people was the ultimate test of whether that society deserved to exist. Ancient Chinese food was not a machine for pleasure. It was a machine for meaning, for connecting the human body to the cosmic order, the living to the ancestors, the ruler to the ruled, the harvest to the rain. Every bowl of millet porridge placed on a farmer's table and every bronze ding filled with sacrificial meat in a lord's ancestral temple were points on the same continuum, a continuum that stretched from the dirt of the fields to the halls of heaven. The food was often plain. The hunger was often real. But the conviction that eating was a moral act, that the kitchen was as important as the temple, that a meal properly prepared and properly shared was a small act of civilization against the chaos of the world. That conviction endures. It is there in every Chinese kitchen today, in every family gathering around a table, in every careful cut of the knife, and every precise measure of seasoning. The ingredients have changed beyond recognition. The spirit has not. This was not just food. It was philosophy made edible, nourishment for the body and for the soul, in a world where both were always hungry.